Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our, I think it's the last Ann Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies lecture of the semester, if I'm not mistaken. We've had an incredible series of talks this semester, and it's going to end on a bang with, or even a wonderful speaker, who I'm going to introduce in a second, which is Professor Ilana Pardes. But let me say a few words first about this lecture, which is an endowed lecture. It is the Lewis and Rachel Lesk Memorial Lecture, and we're very grateful at CJS to the late Dr. David Lesk for creating the Lewis and Rachel Lesk Memorial Fund in Israeli Studies in memory of his parents. The fund provides programming such as lectures, symposia, and conferences to support Israeli studies at the University of Toronto. And we're very thankful today that one of Dr. Lesk's son, Arya Lesk, is present, and we want to thank the Lesk family for your continued support. So thank you very much, Arya, for being here and for your family and for your support. Thank you. So let's turn now to our speaker. Ilana Pardes is the Katharine Cornell Professor of Comparative Literature at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and the Director for the Center of Literary Studies there. She received her PhD in comparative literature from UC Berkeley in 1990. She's taught at Princeton and was a visiting professor at Berkeley and at Harvard. In the fall of 2009, she was a fellow at the Katz Center for Advanced Studies at Penn. And in the fall of 2017, she was a fellow at the Humanities Council at Princeton University. And she's just completed a term as a distinguished visiting professor at Princeton before she goes back to Israel, I think next week. Right, so that's great. If you're not familiar with her work, which is wide-ranging and profound, it's focused on the nexus of the Bible, literature, and culture, as well as on questions of gender, aesthetics, and hermeneutics. She's the author of Countertraditions in the Bible, a Feminist Approach, the Biography of Ancient Israel, National Narratives in the Bible, which I was rereading the other day. It's really a wonderful book worth going back to. So, that's just one of the favorites here. Melville's Bibles, which he showed how the development of Melville was through his reading of the Bible, along with whaling and all kinds of other things. These two things might be interconnected. Agnon's Moonstruck Lovers, the Song of Songs in Israeli Culture, which he delivered as the Stroum lectures at the University of Washington a few years ago. I was there. It was a wonderful thing. I'm happy to host her there and then now here. Recently, she's published The Song of Songs, a biography in Princeton University's Press, a series on the kind of biography of books in the Bible. It's kind of amazing.
Lives of great religious books.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's all kinds of other great series of which yours is a part, so other things I've looked at which are great. And her most recent book is Ruth, the Migrant Gleaner, which came out in Yale in 2022. Her current project is at the intersection of the Bible, particularly the Book of Samuel, Shakespeare, and contemporary political and psychoanalytic thought. So you can get a sense of there's a kind of common set of themes, but also a profound range in that as well. Today, she's going to speak to us about a theme related to her book on Ruth. The title of the talk is The Book of Ruth and the Question of Migration. I'm really pleased to introduce Professor Ilana Pardes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, such a generous introduction. I'd like to begin with a few notes of gratitude. First of all, I'm honored to be speaking here in this endowed lecture of the Center for Jewish Studies. And I'm indebted to Professor Anna Sternschis, the director, and special thanks to Professor Michael Rosenthal for a very generous and special hospitality in the past few days. I've been here for a few days now, and it's really a pleasure to be here. I'm very happy that there's a seminar that is joining us too, so thank you.
You raised your voice.
Yes.
Microphone. Oh, sorry.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Just.
So the book of Ruth has been part of my life. Yeah.
You don't have to lead in.
Okay. I wrote about it already in my first book, in Countertraditions in the Bible. One of the chapters is devoted to a literary feminist reading of the book of Ruth. That was way back. But then, in recent decades, I've been dealing with biblical reception. First with Agnon, and then with the Song of Songs. And then I said, oh, I have to go back to the book of Ruth because it has such a fantastic exegetical history and so many different afterlives. So I was happy to join the series of Jewish lives and to write the volume on Ruth. Now, the series is mostly devoted to biographies of modern Jewish thinkers, writers, artists, but they have a section on biblical figures. So it's not quite your usual biography. We're dealing with a fictional character. So my strategy was, and first of all, there are books there on Jacob and Moses, and with the book of Ruth, you barely have 4 chapters. So, and again, given that I'm interested in the question of reception, so I decided to devote a chapter to a close reading of the book of Ruth, and then move on to discuss the afterlives of Ruth from the Midrash to Toni Morrison and Ellen Ginsberg. So today I will give you a sense of my reading of the text itself, and then I'll primarily focus on Ellen Ginsberg's Kaddish as one of the afterlives that I find particularly compelling. I mean, they're all compelling, but in different ways. Let me just add that my main interest or my main axis when I deal with the book of Ruth is the question of migration. And so there are various ways to read the book of Ruth, and this was my focus. I mean, what happens? I mean, first of all, reading the text itself in light of its migratory dimension, and then how was her foreignness sort of reimagined and reinterpreted in the course of time. So we'll begin with the text itself, and it's really one of the greatest texts in the Bible. The book of Ruth offers the most elaborate tale of a woman to be found in the Bible, but even this relatively detailed account is astonishingly laconic. The book of Ruth is not really a book. It is only 4 chapters long, more of a short story or a very short story than a book. To write a biography of Ruth thus means to become a gleaner, to gather bits and pieces from sparse scenes that are replete with lacunae. And yet, despite its ellipses, Ruth's cryptic tale is remarkable for its capacity to provide, with but few vignettes, a vibrant portrait of one of the most intriguing characters in the Bible. The opening note of the book of Ruth is devoted to a packed expository account of the migration of Elimelech's family from the land of Judah to Moab. Famine drives them to seek bread in Moab. Famine, of course, is a major cause for migration in our own time as well. Much like Abraham and Jacob, who go down to Egypt in times of hunger, Elimelech too migrates to a foreign land in quest of sustenance. He's accompanied by his wife, Naomi, and their 2 sons, Machlon and Kilion. It is a dire migratory tale. Elimelech dies shortly after their move, and 10 years later, the 2 sons die as well. Ruth is first mentioned in this prelude as Machlon's Moabite wife alongside Orpah, Kilion's Moabite wife. We receive no information about her lineage and background. The Midrash fills in this lacuna and endows Ruth with royal hues, turning her into a princess, one of the daughters of Eglon, king of Moab. But in the biblical text itself, Ruth's Moabite past seems to have no relevance. Ruth emerges on stage only on the road between Moab and Bethlehem, on leaving her home and homeland and heading to the land of Judah, a land she had not known hitherto. Her migration is as radical as that of Abraham's inaugural move to Canaan, but different in character. And they're echoes of the sort of the Lech Lecha of Abraham in the book of Ruth. But in Ruth's case, no God calls her out of nowhere and demands that she go forth. Going forth is her own initiative, and her primary objective is not to obey God, but rather to stand by Naomi. With remarkable flair, Ruth endorses chesed, kindness, and chesed is a key word in the text, as her guideline, willing to take all the risks involved in following her impoverished, melancholy mother-in-law to foreign turf. Ruth's tale of migration is an unusual one. Elsewhere in the Bible, in the great stories of migration in Genesis and in Exodus, male characters are the ones to prevail. Here, a woman is set on center stage, and the specificities of the life of a female migrant are spelled out with distinct verve. We follow Ruth through the various stages of her migratory life, from the moment she leaves Moab as a childless widow, determined to join Naomi, to the long process of acculturation in Bethlehem, beginning with her struggle to survive as a gleaner in the barley fields and ending with her marriage to a local, Boaz, and then mothering of Oved. What makes Ruth's migratory tale all the more exceptional is the fact that she's a Moabite. So, I mean, it's unusual to have a woman as a protagonist of a migration story, and even more so, a Moabite, to top it all. So it is a story of a Moabite woman who, on moving to Bethlehem, not only becomes a member of the people of Israel, but also the foremother of King David. This dramatic shift in Ruth's position is indeed one of the enigmas of her biography. Ruth's life is set in the days when the judges ruled. This is the opening verse. The judges, the Shoftim, are tribal chieftains who ruled in the pre-monarchic period, presumably from the 13th century BCE to the 11th century BCE. The association of Ruth with the time of the judges is rather odd, since her tale seems to be the very antithesis of the representation of this period in the book of Judges. The most well-known and recurrent verse of Judges is, "Every man did what was right in his own eyes." Ish hayashar be'einav yaseh. It is an age in which lawlessness and strife prevail. Ad hoc tribal chieftains, the Shoftim, attempt to rescue the weak confederation of Hebrew tribes from their enemies, but shortly after each battle, even after the most successful ones, chaos returns. With its unique ambience, the Book of Ruth offers an alternative human possibility, or perhaps a glimpse of a different chapter within this period. We enter Bethlehem in the days of harvest, with no shadow of an enemy on the horizon. People greet each other with respect in the fields, and legal matters are settled peacefully at the town's gate. There are no villains in the Book of Ruth. In fact, one of the tale's stunning literary feats is its convincing portrayal of good people. Now, this is really an exception to the biblical text. It is a rare world in which chesed, kindness, emerges as a cherished principle of human relations. Ruth is the primary agent of chesed and is hailed for it time and again, but other characters are also construed as kind and compassionate. Even Orpah, who unlike Ruth decides to head back to Moab instead of following her mother-in-law to Bethlehem, is not wicked. Naomi thanks Orpah for her chesed and care while urging her to return to her mother's house. She's a good person, just less good than Ruth. God, too, has a pivotal role in advancing chesed, but he remains behind the scenes. He's not really a character in his voice, and his voice is not heard. It is primarily human agency and human goodness that shape the drama in the Book of Ruth. In a talk on goodness delivered in 2012, Toni Morrison points out that contemporary literature is not interested in goodness on a large or even limited scale. When it appears, it is with a note of apology in its hand and has trouble speaking its name. Critical of this tendency, she harks back to 19th century writers who did not hesitate to explore the far from bland lives of good people. Among other things, Billy Budd, Herman Melville's, and George Eliot's Dorothea. I mean, these are very interesting characters. Biblical narrative, strangely enough, is not that different from modern literature in its suspicion of goodness. More often than not, biographies of prominent biblical figures are replete with scenes of jealousy, cheating, and violence. Jacob tricks his brother Esau. Leah and Rachel engage in fierce struggles over Jacob's love. Joseph's brother fling him into the pit. David sends Uriah to his death in order to conceal his affair with Bathsheba, and many more examples, of course. Ruth's biography, with its substantive attention to goodness, is a rare exception to the rule. Good characters are not flawless, nor are their lives necessarily less miserable or devoid of tension, but they have a unique light, unimaginable generosity that compels all who surround them, even those who try to deny their fascination. So let's get closer to the text itself. The drama begins on the road between Moab and Bethlehem with a scene of 3 women on the move, Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah. We receive no details regarding the appearance or attire of these women, impoverished as they were, embarking on a journey to Bethlehem in quest of sustenance. They were probably dressed in rags, and this is how William Blake imagines them. He has very interesting biblical illustrations, and this is the one. Job is probably the more familiar corpus, but he has this one of Ruth. And I think that what he really conveys poignantly is the drama on the road. It's a sort of desolate road, and this is a family that is falling apart in many ways. They had none of the familiar biblical tokens of wealth, no saddled donkeys and no servants. We don't know how long they walked on the road or whether they talked with other sojourners. To those who watched them pass, they must have seemed an exceptional sight. Women did not travel on their own in biblical times unless they were in dire conditions. And these women are indeed in dire conditions. The road was a male zone. Where exactly were the women located when they began to converse, we're not told. Instead of providing us with elementary expository details, the narrative zooms on a moment of crisis. We can imagine the 3 wayfarers halting for a moment as Naomi begins to speak. Burdened by her sorrows, Naomi now seems to have second thoughts about her daughters-in-law coming to Bethlehem with her, where she urges them to return to Moab. So I think it's very interesting that, this is not something that happens before they go, before they, move ahead to Bethlehem, but sort of on the road, this is where the drama takes place. So here are Naomi's words. Go back, each of you, to her mother's house. May the Lord do kindness with you as you have done with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that you find a settled place, each of you, in the house of her husband. And she kissed them, and they raised their voice and wept. And they said to her, but with you we will go back to your people. And Naomi said, go back, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb who could be husbands to you? Would you wait for them till they grew up? For them would you be deprived of husbands? No, my daughters, for it is far more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has come out against me. Clinging to an elderly widow whose womb is empty, Naomi painfully admits, makes no sense. The sons whom she bore died, and she's too old to begin anew. For a brief moment, she wildly imagines finding a new husband this very night and bearing new sons. But then she dismantles her own fantasy, asking her daughters-in-law whether they would absurdly wait for her imaginary future sons to grow up. And there's a sort of the Leverett law here in the background. Regretting her initial desire to be accompanied by them, she now thanks her daughters-in-law for their kindness, their chesed, and pleads with them to go back to the homes of their Moabite mothers. Depleted as she is, body and soul, she has nothing to offer. Her piercing rhetorical questions are meant to shatter any illusion that this journey could provide a better future. Migrating to an unknown land would only augment their misery, she insists, reducing their chances of settling down and building new families. The emotional intensity of this scene increases as Ruth and Orpah raise their voice and weep. They cry, we may assume, over the losses and hardships that they all share in common, but they also cry at the thought of severing the remainders of a bereaved family. Orpah ends up following Naomi's advice and returns to Moab. Her name, Orpah, calling to mind the word oref, nape, seems to commemorate her decision to turn back. But Orpah is by no means heartless. She chooses the commonsensical path in a world run by men in which a widow is among the most helpless and underprivileged, synonymous with the stranger and the orphan. And this is sort of in the legal corpus of the Bible, Hager Yatom Ve'almana, the stranger, the orphan, and the widow are sort of, they designate the most, the underprivileged sectors in the society. However painful being a widow today may be, it doesn't necessarily entail a loss of income and status. Within the biblical context, however, a widow is by definition lowly, both economically and socially. Being both a widow and a stranger is undoubtedly even worse. Unlike Orpah, Ruth is not swayed by the fear of the double misfortune that may await her on migrating to the land of Judah. She opts for the road less traveled by and remains with her destitute mother-in-law against all odds. Her chesed, we discover, exceeds familiar definitions of compassion and goodness. The meaning of the name Ruth, as it is pronounced in Hebrew, is uncertain, but it may be associated with the term re'ut. In biblical Hebrew, it's a female companion. It is at this climatic moment on the road, as the two sisters-in-law move in opposite directions, that Ruth emerges as a distinct character, speaking for the first time on her own. She delivers the most resonant lines of the tale with great passion and stubborn audacity. So this is, of course, a very renowned declaration of love and loyalty. ותאמר רות, אל תפגעי בי לעוזבך לשוב מאחרייך, כי אל אשר תלכי אלך, ובאשר תליני אלין, עמך עמי ואלוהיך אלוהי. Do not entreat me to forsake you, to turn back from you, for wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people is my people, and your God is my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. So may the Lord do to me, or even more, for only death will part you and me. Ruth's moving oath of love and loyalty is so well known, so oft cited, that its beauty and power might go unnoticed. Earlier, Ruth's words merge with those of Orpah, but now that her sister-in-law has left, Ruth speaks differently, shifting from prose to poetry, using parallel clauses or parallelisms, and this is the predominant feature of biblical poetry. When biblical narrative introduces brief poetic insights into the prose, it often marks a heightened moment, a dramatic scene that calls for special attention. Ruth's oath is one such moment, the majestic opening parallelism with its rhythmic force and emphatic repetition, for wherever you go, I will go, sets the tone for the rest. Ruth's insistence on going with Naomi is nothing short of total. It means lodging wherever Naomi lodges, even if her mother-in-law finds no real abode in Bethlehem. It means going so far as adopting her mother-in-law's people and God as her own. Only death will part them, but in a sense, not even death. For Ruth is determined to be buried wherever her mother-in-law is buried. Ruth's exceptional oath, however, would not have granted her entry into Bethlehem had it not included a commitment to Naomi's God and people. In modern seasons of migration, potential immigrants are meticulously inspected by the authorities of their host country to verify that they meet the required criterion. Of course, it's a pressing problem in our own time. So it's always interesting to get some kind of historical perspective. Marrying a citizen is often considered as a viable criterion. In the biblical text, the prospect of acceptance through marriage is more ambiguous. Intermarriage is usually condemned, which is why there are no official guidelines. Nonetheless, in practice, intermarriage is often regarded as permissible. Think of Moses and Zipporah, not to mention the many foreign wives of David, Solomon. The implicit precept seems to be that foreign wives are accepted as long as they do not violate the monotheistic underpinnings of life and are willing to efface their cultural past. So it's not quite a hyphenated identity. It's a different perception of migration. Ruth is a model daughter-in-law and a model migrant, but her phenomenal declaration of loyalty is not lauded by Naomi. Instead of falling in Ruth's arm and expressing her gratitude, Naomi does not utter a word. Characters in the Bible, as Robert Alter points out, are often unpredictable, in some ways impenetrable, constantly emerging from and slipping back into a penumbra of ambiguity. One of the wonders of biblical narrative, in fact, lies in its invitation, or rather its demand, that we explore silences and consider divergent possibilities of motive and emotional response. And of course, Eric Auerbach's essay is a touchstone in this respect too. Although the biblical narrator is omniscient, we as readers are not. We must learn about characters the same way we learn about the people in our daily lives, through ongoing conjecture. We may surmise that Naomi's choice to cease talking with Ruth on the road discloses her ambivalence. Despite her genuine care for her daughter-in-law, she may be reluctant to have her by her side. Is Naomi troubled now that they're approaching Bethlehem by Ruth's Moabite origin? Possibly. But there's another interpretive route. We may equally assume that her silence is a mark of her deep melancholy. Miserable as Naomi is, she may be feeling unworthy of her daughter-in-law's compassion, or else incapable of delighting in the remarkable gift of chesed offered to her. These diverse readings are not mutually exclusive. Naomi may be both ambivalent and melancholy, both loving and withdrawn. Whatever the reasons for this lacuna may be, the two women continue to walk together to Bethlehem, and Naomi no longer tries to dissuade Ruth. Strictly speaking, only Ruth is a migrant who enters an unknown town. But in many ways, Naomi too is a migrant, or even a double migrant. Her first migration was to Moab, and now on returning to Bethlehem after 10 years away, and after the disasters that befell her, she feels acutely uprooted yet again. Ruth and Naomi share the stage in intricate ways, each contributing different hues to this tale of migration, whereas Ruth is more poignantly the foreigner, the Moabite, who joins a people she had not known heretofore. Naomi is the one who expresses more extensively the inner tumult of self-estrangement. The penultimate verse of the opening chapter of the book of Ruth underscores their inseparability. And Naomi came back, and her daughter-in-law with her, who was coming back from the plains of Moab. As surprising as it may first seem, Ruth, much like Naomi, is considered to be returning to her homeland, though she had never set foot in the land of Judah before. Much as they share homecoming, they also share their respective migrations. The whole town is astir as the two women arrive in Bethlehem. In this exceptional text in which women's agency is foregrounded, Bethlehem too is perceived at first sight at least as a feminine world. It is the women of Bethlehem who approach them. Rushing towards Naomi, they ask, "Is this Naomi?" They probably find it difficult to recognize her after all these years, but Naomi regards their question on a different register as relevant to her deep sense of estrangement. "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for Shaddai, God, has dealt great bitterness to me. I went out full, and empty did the Lord bring me back. Why should you call me Naomi when the Lord has borne witness against me, and Shaddai, the Almighty, has done me harm?" She conveys her inner alienation by dissociating herself from her name, the quintessential marker of identity. The name Naomi, akin to pleasant, no longer suits her, she laments. A more appropriate name would be Mara, the bitter one. Not unlike Job, and this is really a female counterpart to the book of Job. Naomi protests against God, who has tortured her mercilessly with no apparent reason. Once again, there's a shift from prose to poetry, underscoring the emotional intensity of the moment. In a forceful parallelism, Naomi juxtaposes her emptiness with the fullness with which she was blessed on leaving for Moab. I went out full, and empty did the Lord bring me back. Ani mele'a halachti v'rika meshivani ana. This is a beautiful parallelism. If earlier on the road she spoke of God's hand leveled against her, now that she has returned without a husband and sons to an empty home, she spells out her complaint towards the heavens. In bold strokes, she portrays herself as a defendant in an unjust legal court. The punishment has already been executed, and yet the charges and the evidence remain disturbingly unknown. So there's no theodicy in the book of Ruth. It's a really a Jobin moment. I mean, okay, this was the first section on the biblical text itself, and we actually only discussed the first chapter primarily. You know, we have 3 more to go, but I'll use this as our point of departure. Let me just say that there are different readings of the Book of Ruth as a migratory tale. Bonnie Honig, who's a political theorist, she's the one who regards the Book of Ruth or regards Ruth as a sort of exemplary migrant, but exemplary in the sense that she effaces her cultural past and then is basically she reads it as sort of an equivalent of The Handmaid's Tale, and it's sort of exploited by her mother-in-law. That's just one way to read it. The other one is by Kristeva in her very interesting book on Strangers to Ourselves, where she regards the Book of Ruth as a book that invites us to consider the fertility of the other. So, you know, there's something phenomenal here, because you have a foreign woman who is situated at the very base of the most cherished dynasty of all, you know. And so she regards it as you know, the kind of unexpected light that the stranger can provide us. And actually the emphasis on the fact that Ruth remains a stranger is something that is so wondrous and exceptional about this text. In my own reading, I really see it as an incredibly, I mean, in biblical terms, a favorable presentation of a Moabite woman, but I do take into account some of the ambivalent moments, you know, like Naomi's silence. I mean, how to read it, again, it's left to our imagination as readers. So you have that, and the other thing that I emphasize is the extent to which Naomi too is part of this migratory tale, sort of their shared migration. Okay, so now afterlives, and with the afterlives, I mean, there's so much. I mean, you know, I begin with the Midrash, where, you know, Ruth is regarded as an exemplary convert, and her foreignness is domesticated. Then in the Zohar, actually, they marvel at her Moabite origin in a sort of paradoxical, mystical reading. Actually, the very fact that she's a Moabite is helpful when you're seeking redemption, because redemption is unexpected to begin with. So having a Moabite is helpful. And she's the embodiment of the exilic Shekhinah. So actually her suffering as a migrant is compatible with the notion of the Shekhinah, the feminine facet of the deity, as one whose cry is heard in exile. Okay, just to give you some of the early takes on it. And I'm going to focus on the modern period, but in order to do that, just a few glimpses of art. And Ruth has a privileged role in art. And in art, this is where she's reimagined as a pastoral gleaner. Again, in a sense, her foreignness is domesticated within this interpretive line. I mean, it's very different than what the rabbis do, but here too, I mean, this was what I was, you know, starting with today's perspective of Ruth as primarily a migratory tale. You know, I'm sort of curious to see what happened before, you know, who sort of highlights her foreignness and to what extent is it relegated to the margins. So this is a beautiful painting by Poussin. It's part of his 4 Seasons, and where he sort of matches different biblical texts with the seasons. And Ruth and Boaz designate the summer, and you see he's a master of landscape, so he has a sort of the fecundity of nature. You have the blissful meaning in the fields. They really seem like reapers. They're sort of playing. It's a sort of pastoral rendition of the Book of Ruth. You know, no one sweats here. It's it's beautiful. And by the way, this is over here. This is the embodiment of the Davidic castle. You know, so you have the sort of redemptive light in the background. So I mean, again, this is 17th century. So this is where the pastoral Ruth is being was invented with Poussin primarily. And it became a major tradition and was imitated by many other artists that followed. Later on, it had its Orientalist twist as well, the sort of Orientalist pastoral. Not going to have time to talk about it today, but just to give you another example, very much along, I mean, it's very much in keeping with Poussin, Koch, a bit later. But of course, I think this is a very common, as far as, you know, the icons, the visual interpretations of the Book of Ruth, this is probably the most dominant and well-known one. I mean, in your Bible, in your children's Bible, I mean, that's how Ruth appears. So here too, in a different way, her foreignness is relegated to the margins. She's a local, and the scene in the fields is hailed as a sort of pastoral moment of human goodness at its best, and you know, also nature at its best. I wanted to give you a sense of this tradition, because I think that a lot of the things that we'll see in modern adaptations of the Book of Ruth, where she becomes a paradigmatic migrant woman, have to do with a sort of anti-pastoral stance. And this would be, I mean, here, you know, if you think of Ode to a Nightingale by Keats, where she stands amid alien corn, beautiful lines. That would be one example, an early example in poetry. And now we'll move on to Allen Ginsberg. Well, it's quite a shift, but let's do it. Okay. One wintry day in November 1958, as Allen Ginsberg walked down the streets of New York, Lower East Side, he suddenly realized that these were the same streets his mother had known as a little girl after she arrived from Russia. On returning to his apartment, he sat down at his desk and wrote the opening lines of Kaddish for Naomi Ginsberg, 1894-1956, an elegy for his mother that would become one of his most renowned poems. Ginsberg has started to work on this poem a year earlier in a hotel in Paris, but couldn't find the right rhythm. It was only on having his vision of his mother's past as an immigrant that something opened up in his writing. Naomi Ginsberg was born in 1894 in a small town of Neville, then part of Russia. By 1905, the frequency of pogroms in Western Russia had pushed the family to leave. They immigrated to the United States and settled, like many other Jewish immigrants of the time, in the Lower East Side. Several years later, the family moved across the bridge to Newark, where Naomi went to high school and later trained to become a teacher. Shortly after she met Louis Ginsberg, Allen Ginsberg's father, she had a mental breakdown. Many more followed in the course of her life. During her stay in diverse mental institutions, she received increasingly harsh treatments, among them shock therapy, the standard treatment of patients with paranoid schizophrenia at the time. She died in 1956. At her funeral, there weren't enough men to have a minyan, a quorum of 10 male Jewish adults that are required for the prayer. As a result, the traditional Jewish prayer of the dead, the mourner's Kaddish, could not be recited. Allen Ginsberg was in Berkeley at the time and was unable to come to the funeral. His poem Kaddish is, in a sense, an attempt to compensate for this lack. The traditional Kaddish is a hymn of praises addressed to God, written mostly in Aramaic with a few Hebrew words. It is delivered as an affirmation of faith in the face of death, though death is never mentioned. The central theme of the Kaddish is the magnification and sanctification of God's name. In Ginsburg, heretical Kaddish, however, the name that is most cherished is not God, but Naomi. And death does not only lurk behind the scenes, but moves to center stage. No dark detail is avoided in Ginsburg's mournful homage to his mother. In Kaddish, Ginsburg employs the same long associative line he had used a few years earlier in How, but whereas in How he bears witness to the best minds of his generation, destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, in Kaddish, the most personal of his poems, he cries over one particular mad mind, that of his mother. The staccato phrasing created by abrupt transitions and dashes is meant in this case to elicit the same sobbing from the listener as it did from the poet. Fragmentary details pour out incessantly, one after the other. We receive bits and pieces of Naomi Ginsburg's biography, accompanied by a plethora of brief references to books, songs, and films that are somehow associated with her. The Book of Ruth has special resonance within Ginsburg's associative flow. At the end of section 2, he depicts his mother as a woman who was once like the long-tressed Naomi of Bible, or Ruth who wept in America. This biblical allusion has much salience given that Ginsburg repeatedly speaks of his mother as Naomi rather than mom or mother. Although Naomi Ginsburg is primarily a modern counterpart of the biblical Naomi, she also embodies Ruth's misery. She's both the long-tressed Naomi and Ruth who wept in America. In keeping with the intertwining of the lives of Ruth and Naomi in the biblical text, Ginsburg allows the two biblical women to merge in his mother's portrait. The long tresses add a biblical aura to the picture, and the weeping underlies the migratory experiences the two share in common as they enter Bethlehem. In Kaddish, the hardships of Ruth and Naomi acquire new life through the tears of a later 20th century immigrant woman who couldn't quite find her way in the promised land of America. But Ginsburg's biblical typology extends even further. As one who lovingly follows in Naomi's footsteps wherever she goes, he too is a Ruth of sorts. The very inception of the poem, after all, is indebted to Ginsburg's walking where his mother walked, adhering to her route across the Lower East Side. The visceral, rhythmic first lines of Kaddish capture the emotional intensity of that moment. So, wait a second. Let's hear it.
Kaddish for Naomi Ginsburg, 1894, 1956. Strange now to think of you, gone without corsets and eyes, while I walk on the sunny pavement of Greenwich Village, downtown Manhattan, clear winter noon, and I've been up all night talking, reading Kaddish aloud, listening to Ray Charles' blues shout blind on the phonograph, the rhythm, and your memory in my head 3 years after. And I read Adonaius's last triumphant stanzas aloud, wept, realizing how we suffer and how death is that remedy all singers dream of. Sing, remember, prophesy, as in the Hebrew anthem or the Buddhist book of answers, and my own imagination of a withered leaf at dawn, dreaming back through life, your time and mine accelerating toward apocalypse, the final moment, the flower burning in the day, and what comes after. Looking back on the mind itself that saw an American city, a flash away, and the great dream of me or China, or you and a phantom Russia, or a crumbled bed that never existed, like a poem in the dark, escaped back to oblivion. No more to say, and nothing to weep for but the beings in the dream, trapped in its disappearance, sighing.
Yeah, we'll stop here. It's all available on YouTube. It's very powerful to hear him read it. I'll just read a few more lines because I didn't want to skip. But then he says, it leaps about me as I go out and walk the street, look back over my shoulder, 7th Avenue, the battlements of window office buildings, shouldering each other high under a cloud, tall as the sky an instant, and the sky above an old blue place. Or down the avenue to the south, too, as I walk towards the Lower East Side, where you walked 50 years ago, little girl from Russia, eating the first poisonous tomatoes of America, frightened on the dock. Then struggling in the crowds of Orchard Street. Towards what? As Ginsberg steps into his mother world, unexpected memories of the past resurface with dreamy force. It's a sort of Proustian moment. He begins with several fragments of the first years of his mother as a little impoverished immigrant girl, imagining her emotional responses. He depicts her standing frightened on the dock and struggling in the crowds of Orchard Street, one of the renowned streets of the Lower East Side. He even records her conviction that tomatoes were poisonous, a common suspicion among Russian Jewish immigrants in the early 20th century who had never seen tomatoes before. But in Naomi's case, migratory anxieties were enhanced by an inclination towards psychosis. With striking audacity, Ginsberg goes on to provide a compassionate close-up of the gradual deterioration of his mother's mind. The poisonous tomatoes were a prelude to many paranoid hallucination that followed. Some were colored by communist condemnations of capitalist America. Others were closer to home, revolving around different family members. Ginsberg displays the whole range. The enemy's approach, what? Poisons, tape recorders, FBI? I'm a great woman. I'm truly a beautiful soul. And because of that, they, Hitler, grandma, the capitalists, want to shut me up. The intensity of Ginsberg's devotion to his ill mother and his eagerness to identify with her are in many ways as exceptional as Ruth's bold clinging to the destitute, melancholy Naomi on the road between Moab and Bethlehem. No one else in Ginsberg's family was capable of drawing so close to her or willing to try. And yet Kaddish's somber modern take on the Book of Ruth cannot but complicate the question of loyalty. While being deeply committed to his Naomi, Ginsberg is also something of a failed Ruth. Beset by guilt for deserting his mother on various occasions, he discloses with undeniable pain the limits of his devotion. After bringing his mother to a rest home at the age of 12, at her request, he was haunted by regret. I left on the next bus to New York, abandoning her. Engulfed by love, guilt, and an acute sense of loss, Ginsberg strives to carve out a new mode of loyalty, a poetic one. He casts his mother in the role of a strange, glorious muse, whose teachings need to be cherished and followed. Oh, glorious muse that bore me with the womb, gave suck, first mystic life taught me talk and music, from whose pained head I first took vision, tortured and beaten in the skull. What mad hallucinations of the damned that drive me out of my own skull to seek eternity till I find peace for thee, oh, poetry. Ginsberg craves to recall bitter moments when his charismatic artistic mother taught him much about music and talk, but she inspired him no less in her madness. Tortured and beaten in the skull, Naomi manages to draw Ginsberg out of his own skull to urge him to explore possibilities beyond the bland zones of the knowable or fully discernible. Her mad hallucinations open up new horizons of a poetic writing that is fragmentary, not always explicable, but always full of vision. Of the many chaotic visions of his mother, Ginsberg singles out a letter she wrote to him during her last days at the mental hospital of Pilgrim State. The letter was sent to him by a hospital worker and arrived a few days after Naomi's death. It emerged as a voice beyond the grave. Oh, wait a second. Back. Okay, never mind. Here's how it goes. Strange prophecies anew, she wrote. The key is in the window. The key is in the sunlight at the window. I have the key. Get married, Ellen. Don't take drugs. The key is in the bars, in the sunlight, in the window. Love your mother, which is Naomi. Naomi's cryptic letter is rather nebulous, but Ginsberg embraces it as an oracular guideline. Searching for a key in the window becomes a mystical poetic code. an invitation to seek light and liberty even when one is locked in. But Naomi has additional advice of a different bent. Get married, Alan, don't take drugs. She sounds for a moment like the Jewish mother of stereotype. And yet here, these scattered words convey the heart-rending love of a schizophrenic mother grasping for some clarity before her death, determined to pass on to her son a bit of beneficial advice. As a gay man and an avid consumer of drugs, Ginsberg cannot possibly follow these instructions, but he does venture to adopt something of his mother's unintentional guidance by incorporating her within his own literary genealogy. He preserves familial continuity not through marriage and offspring, but rather through a literary yibum, a literary variation on the Leverett law, writing the poetry his mother couldn't write, taking his cue from the remainders of her discourse. And just to remind you of the Leverett law, the yibum, it's laid out in Deuteronomy, and it's very central to the book of Ruth. I mean, according to the law, if a married man dies without children, it is the duty of one of his brothers to marry the widow, and the son of the union is considered to be the son of the deceased. So you would say, what is this, the Leverett law? It has no meaning in our own world. But I think in the modern adaptations of it, they actually call attention to its relevance. I mean, the extent to which we try to fulfill the dreams of family members, our parents, our brothers, our siblings. And also something similar. I mean, I also have another chapter on Israeli culture where I find a similar phenomenon in Agnon's Vidmia Mea, in the prime of her life, the sort of tiltza writing, the text her mother couldn't write. I mean, these are two modern adaptations in which the whole question of the Leverett law is reinterpreted. And for Ginsberg, it means, sort of following in her footsteps, completing something she couldn't say, she couldn't do, she couldn't write. In Kaddish, for the first time in his literary career, Ginsberg positions himself not only as a founding figure of the Beat generation, but also as the descendant of an immigrant Jewish muse. His mother's dislocations, he admits, have had a ripple effect in his own life. Her Lower East Side is his Lower East Side. Her Jewish Russian heritage is his own, much as her weeping and maddened discourse is also his own. Ginsberg never hid his Jewish background, but in his elegy for his mother, he displays his heritage more openly than ever before. He goes so far as to use the Aramaic term Kaddish as a title while inserting snippets from the Aramaic and Hebrew of the traditional prayer in transliteration at different points of his poem. So today, evocations of Kaddish, if you're a Jewish American writer, you almost have to do it. Think of Angels in America, Kushner's, or Leon Wieseltier's Kaddish. But when Ginsberg does it, this is 1961, this is, and citing foreign words and calling his poem Kaddish, this is an unusual move, all the more so for a Beat poet. Hannah Wirtnesher describes first-generation Jewish American writers, the sons and daughters of immigrants, as often immersed in fashioning their own distinctive voices by inscribing traces of immigrant speech into their writing by retaining an accent of ethnicity. In Kaddish, Ginsberg partakes in this project as he places the then marginalized languages of Jewish culture at the cutting edge of the American literary canon. And yet, while seeking to construct new meanings for Americanness, he's equally invested in reshaping Jewish tradition. His Kaddish is a heretical poem, not only because it revolves around Naomi rather than God, but also because it endorses other cultural tradition, be they Buddhist teachings or the memorable rhythms of Ray Charles's blues. In transferring Ruth's tale to the Lower East Side, Ginsberg wants to repair the past and welcome his mother into American culture as a belated home, to turn her into a Beat muse. But his mode of poetic acculturation by no means entails an erasure of a cultural past or the exceptional features of her life. Outcast as his Naomi Ruth is, there is something about her lack of assimilability that Ginsberg admires, that inspires him to envision himself as a sacrilegious poet singing his Kaddish in the wilderness while declaring, I'm unmarried, I'm hymnless, I'm heavenless. So just as a few fragments, and I'd like to conclude with a few textual leftovers. Or let me explain. In the book, in my epilogue, I used a few of my leftovers. I don't know if it ever happened to you. I'm sure it did. I hope it did. But you know, when you write a book or something, and then there are all these things that you couldn't quite include because they didn't quite fit. So given that I felt like a gleaner, and I was also inspired by Agnes Varda's amazing film on the gleaners and I, which is, anyways, gleaning is a very interesting phenomenon. But in our academic work, we have all these leftovers. And who said leftovers don't count? So there were all these fragments that I couldn't quite use in the book because they didn't fit for one reason or another. And this is how I end the book, with some of these fragments. Among them, Keats' Ode to a Nightingale, or just, but I discussed them briefly. And another one with which that is very compatible with Allen Ginsberg's reading, and it's a midrash. It's from Ruth Rabbah, the sort of the substantive corpus of the midrash on the Book of Ruth, and it's very brief. So it's a minuscule commentary in Ruth Rabbah on Naomi's condition just before leaving Moab. She's described as being a remnant of remnants, shiarei shiari. With but 2 words, this midrashic gem poignantly depicts her disintegration at the lowest point of her life. The choice of metaphor, remnant of remnants, is not without significance. It provides not only a poignant image of the melancholy Naomi, who had lost her husband and 2 sons, but also an implicit portrait of Ruth as a figurative gleaner. From the rabbi's perspective, Ruth's chesed towards Naomi is displayed, as it were, both in the sheaves she provides and in her commitment to pick up the pieces of her mother-in-law's broken life. So it's really a beautiful midrash, just like 2 words, entire world. So, and my very final lines in the book, I'll share with you. It is difficult to part from Ruth, but then luckily she never quite leaves us, determined as she is to follow us wherever we go. Thank you.